Yeah, the old man's gone, and we don't need a babysitter anymore. Jonathan Davidson Jr. stood in the doorway of my small room on the third floor of the Davidson estate. His expensive suit wrinkled from what I assumed was a long night of grieving at the country club bar. His wife Priscilla hovered behind him, already eyeing my few belongings like she was calculating how quickly she could redecorate the space. I had been expecting this moment since the phone call came 3 days ago. Mr. Davidson, the man I had cared for, listened to, and genuinely loved like the grandfather I'd never had, was gone, and with him, my place in this world of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and people who measured worth by the number of zeros in their bank accounts. Of course, I said quietly, folding my uniform shirts into the same battered suitcase I'd arrived with 5 years ago. I'll be out by this afternoon. Good, Priscilla chimed in, her voice sharp with satisfaction. We'll be converting this room into a proper guest suite, something more appropriate for people of our standing. I had been just the nanny for 5 years, but the truth was, I'd been so much more than that. When Mrs. Davidson had passed away 7 years ago, and their son had hired me to care for 8-year-old Sophie, I'd walked into a house filled with sadness and silence. Mr. Davidson Sr., Alexander, had been drowning in grief, his business empire running on autopilot while he sat in his study, staring at photos of his late wife. Sophie had been acting out, desperate for attention from a father who could barely look at her without seeing the wife he'd lost. The expensive therapists couldn't reach her. The previous 3 nannies had quit within months, citing her behavioral problems. But I saw something different in Sophie's tantrums and defiance. I saw a little girl who was terrified that everyone she loved would disappear, just like her mother had. So I stayed, through the midnight screaming, the deliberate destruction of toys, the attempts to run away. I stayed, and slowly, Sophie began to trust that I wouldn't abandon her. As Sophie healed, so did Alexander. He started joining us for dinner, then bedtime stories, then weekend trips to the zoo, the museum, the beach. What began as a professional arrangement evolved into something that felt remarkably like a family, the kind I'd never had growing up in foster care. But to Jonathan Jr. and Priscilla, I remained invisible, just the nanny who happened to be present during family gatherings, who they spoke around rather than to, who they treated like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed to be moved out of the way. Where will you go? Sophie's voice came from behind her father. At 13, she'd grown into a beautiful young woman with her grandfather's kind eyes and her grandmother's gentle spirit, but right now, those eyes were filled with tears. Don't worry about me, sweetheart, I said, forcing a smile. I'll find something. I always do. But Grandpa said, Sophie started, but her father cut her off. Sophie, go to your room, the adults are talking. I watched her reluctantly retreat down the hallway, her shoulders slumped with the weight of another loss. In 5 years, she'd lost her mother, watched her grandfather decline from a heart attack, and now she was losing the only constant caregiver she'd known. The funeral is tomorrow at 2 p.m., Jonathan said, loosening his tie. Family only, of course, I'm sure you understand. Family only. After 5 years of caring for his father's health, managing his medications, driving him to doctor's appointments, and being the one person Alexander confided in during his final months, I wasn't family, I was staff. Of course, I repeated, my voice steady despite the hollow ache in my chest. As I continued packing, memories flooded back. Alexander teaching me chess in his study while Sophie did homework at the coffee table. The 3 of us baking catastrophically awful cookies for Sophie's school bake sale because Alexander insisted we build character through failure. The quiet conversations we'd had during his recovery from his second heart attack, when he'd told me stories about building his business empire from nothing, about the wife he'd loved for 35 years, about his fears for Sophie's future. You're the only one who sees her, he'd said one evening, watching Sophie practice piano through the doorway. Jonathan sees a trust fund. Priscilla sees a social obligation, but you see Sophie. I had treasured those words because they felt like recognition, not just of my job performance, but of my value as a person. In a house where I was often treated like I was invisible, Alexander had made me feel seen. 3 hours later, I was loading my suitcase into my 10-year-old Honda when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Miss Torres? This is Harold Whitman from Whitman, Brooks Associates. I was Mr. Davidson's estate attorney. My stomach dropped. Had they discovered some irregularity in my employment? Some reason to deny me my final paycheck? Yes, sir. I need you to be present for the reading of Mr. Davidson's will tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's quite important that you attend. I glanced back at the mansion, where I could see Jonathan and Priscilla through the floor-to-ceiling windows, already rearranging furniture in the main living room. Mr. Whitman, I'm not family, I was just the Miss Torres. His voice was firm but kind. Mr. Davidson was very specific about your attendance being required. Please don't be late. The law offices of Whitman Brooks Associates occupied the top 3 floors of downtown Seattle's most prestigious building. I'd never been inside, but Alexander had mentioned Harold Whitman many times over the years. They'd been friends since college, and Harold had handled all of Alexander's legal affairs for over 30 years. I arrived 20 minutes early, wearing the only dress I owned that seemed appropriate for such a formal setting, a simple black dress I'd bought for Mrs. Davidson's funeral years ago. The receptionist directed me to a conference room with windows overlooking Elliott Bay, where Jonathan, Priscilla, and Sophie were already seated around a massive mahogany table. What is she doing here? Priscilla hissed as I entered. I was asked to attend, I said quietly, taking a seat near the back of the room. Sophie turned and gave me a small wave, which earned her a sharp look from her father. Harold Whitman entered precisely at 10 a.m., carrying a thick folder and wearing the expression of a man who had been practicing law long enough to anticipate drama. He was in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Thank you all for coming, he began, settling into his chair. Alexander was very specific about how he wanted this handled, so we'll proceed exactly as he instructed. He opened the folder and withdrew several documents. Alexander Davidson's will is quite straightforward in most respects. However, there are some elements that may come as a surprise. Jonathan leaned forward, his confidence evident. As the only child, he'd clearly expected this to be a formality. First, Harold continued, to my son Jonathan Davidson Jr., I leave the Davidson family home and its contents, excluding items specifically mentioned elsewhere in this document. Priscilla squeezed Jonathan's hand, her diamond wedding ring catching the morning light streaming through the windows. To my daughter-in-law Priscilla Davidson, I leave my late wife's jewelry collection, excluding her engagement ring and wedding bands. And to my beloved granddaughter Sophie Davidson, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $5 million, to be managed by the trustee of my choosing until she reaches the age of 25. Sophie's eyes widened. Even at 13, she understood that $5 million was life-changing money. Harold paused, looking directly at me. The trustee for Sophie's fund will be Maria Torres, who will also receive an annual fee of $50,000 for managing this responsibility. The room fell silent. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. $50,000 annually just for managing Sophie's trust? That was more than I'd made in any single year of my life. But Harold wasn't finished. Now, regarding the bulk of the estate, he lifted a separate document. Alexander Davidson's business holdings, investment portfolios, real estate properties, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $47 million, are bequeathed entirely to Maria Elena Torres. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. $47 million. To me. Jonathan shot to his feet so quickly his chair toppled backward. That's impossible, she's just the nanny, this has to be a mistake. There's no mistake, Harold said calmly. I reviewed this will with Alexander multiple times over the past 2 years. He was very clear about his intentions. Priscilla's face had gone white. He can't do this. She manipulated him, influenced him. This is elder abuse. Mrs. Davidson, Harold's voice took on a sharper edge. I've known Alexander for over 30 years. He was of completely sound mind when he executed this will. In fact, he anticipated there might be challenges to his decisions. He withdrew another document. Alexander asked me to read this letter in the event of any disputes. Harold cleared his throat and began reading. To my son Jonathan, if you are hearing this letter, it means you are contesting my final wishes. I am disappointed, but not surprised. You have spent your adult life waiting for me to die so you could inherit what I built. You visited me twice in the past year, both times to ask for money. You enrolled Sophie in boarding school without consulting me because her presence in the house was inconvenient for your social calendar. You are my son, and I love you, but you are not the man I hoped you would become. Jonathan's face was scarlet with rage and humiliation. Harold continued, Maria Torres has been more of a daughter to me than many biological children are to their parents. She cared for me through my illnesses. She held my hand during my darkest moments after your mother's death. She loved Sophie unconditionally when the rest of our family saw her as an obligation. She asked for nothing beyond her modest salary, never once hinting that she expected or wanted anything more. My eyes filled with tears as Harold read Alexander's words that honored not just my work, but my heart. The money I am leaving to Maria is not charity, it is payment for 5 years of devotion, loyalty, and love that cannot be measured in dollars. She earned every penny by being the family you chose not to be. The room was silent except for the sound of my quiet crying. Harold set down the letter. There's more. Alexander also left specific instructions that if anyone contests this will, their inheritance will be donated to charity, the house, the jewelry, Sophie's trust fund, all of it. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Priscilla gripped his arm, her knuckles white. Finally, Harold said, Alexander left individual letters for each of you. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Alexander's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter that began, My dear Maria, by now you know that I have tried to repay a debt that can never truly be repaid. You gave me back my family when I thought I had lost everything. You gave Sophie the mother she needed when her own was taken from her. You gave me purpose in my final years. I couldn't read through my tears, but I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. Sophie had received her own letter and was reading it with wonder. Whatever Alexander had written to her was making her smile through her tears. Jonathan and Priscilla read their letters in stony silence. I could only imagine what Alexander had written to them, probably a final attempt to explain his decisions. Maybe a hope that they would understand why he had chosen to recognize loyalty over biology. Harold stood up. The estate transfer will take approximately 30 days to complete. Maria, I'll need to schedule several meetings with you to discuss the management of your inheritance. As we filed out of the conference room, Sophie broke away from her parents and ran to me. She threw her arms around my waist and whispered, Grandpa knew. He knew you were really family. Jonathan grabbed Sophie's arm. We're leaving, now. But as they reached the door, Sophie turned back. Maria, will I still see you, even though I don't need a nanny anymore? I looked at her father, then back at her. Sweetheart, I'm your trustee now. I'll be in your life until you're 25, whether your father likes it or not. For the first time since I'd met her, Priscilla looked genuinely frightened. 6 months later, I was sitting in the study of my new home, a modest house in Sophie's school district that I'd bought with a tiny fraction of my inheritance. The rest was being invested and managed by the same financial advisors who had helped Alexander build his wealth. Sophie visited twice a week 4 trust fund meetings, which mostly involved homework help and conversations about her future. Jonathan and Priscilla had initially tried to fight the arrangement, but Harold Whitman had made it clear that any interference with the trustee relationship would trigger the charity clause in Alexander's will. I'd also started a foundation in Alexander's memory, focused on supporting children in foster care, kids like I had been, who needed someone to see their potential and invest in their futures. The Davidson family home sat empty. Jonathan and Priscilla had moved to a smaller place after discovering that the mansion came with enormous property taxes and maintenance costs they couldn't afford without Alexander's income. They'd tried to sell it, but the real estate market was slow, and they were asking too much. Meanwhile, I lived quietly, still adjusting to the reality that I would never have to worry about money again. The girl who had aged out of foster care at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and determination was now worth more than she had ever dreamed possible. But the real treasure wasn't the money, it was the letter from Alexander that I kept framed on my desk, and the knowledge that for 5 years, I had been exactly where I was supposed to be, loving and being loved by a family that had chosen me just as much as I had chosen them. Sometimes the people who treat you like you're invisible are the ones who can't see what's right in front of them. Sometimes the family that matters isn't the one you're born into, but the one you build through love, loyalty, and showing up when it counts. And sometimes, just the nanny becomes so much more than anyone imagined, including herself. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or treated like you don't matter, remember that your worth isn't determined by how others see you. The right people will recognize your value, and when they do, it can change everything. Share this story if you believe that love and loyalty are the most valuable currencies in the world, and subscribe for more stories about family, recognition, and the power of being seen for who you really are.